I've just got a message from someone, and they seem to be responding. He was actually writing the message under my boxing video. Um, Whether or not I'll remove that, I'm not sure yet. I haven't decided. If I don't remove it, you'll be able to see our whole dialogue and the context of it. It's about issues of Chinese neo-nationalists. A few years ago, I made a response to a state visit by Hu Jintao. He visited London's Chinatown. Anyway, as I acknowledged, I was not very diplomatic in my critique of some of the issues around that. I should have been more diplomatic. I should have been more. The way I worded things was a little bit, I guess, childish or a little bit extreme, perhaps. And I acknowledge that. I shouldn't have worded it that way. But now that this guy's, he's added me to his circles as well, which I'm trying to find a way to get rid of that. He had absolutely no right to do that. In fact, quite honestly, I want no connection with this guy. I don't know who he is, and I don't know why he's contacting me personally. My comments were not towards any individual particularly, it was on a public thread, so yeah, I'm a little disconcerted that I've been contacted by this guy, but anyway, I want to get to the point. The title of this video is Biased Chinese Media, and there is a provocative angle to that, I concede, but the reason I'm saying it is because I'm getting fed up with seeing a lot of Chinese people whinge about biased Western media, and I like to address this subject a little bit. I have a little bit of background in journalism. I haven't been a journalist, but it's something I studied at university, and I do know something about the industry. This goes back to 2008 when there was a whole issue over the unrest in Tibet, and a lot of Chinese complained about Western networks like CNN and the BBC were not being fair in their coverage of China. And they responded in a very vociferous way, sort of like, oh, look at the biased Western media, and they use YouTube, by the way, to complain about it, which is just hypocritical, because YouTube is an American company, which is banned in China, I would remind them. I find these people to be very guilty of double standards, because they are criticizing the Western media, and yet they are completely saying nothing about Chinese media. Now, China is one of the worst countries in the world for press freedom. I'm sorry, but that is just a fact. If that offends you, I'm sorry. Sometimes the truth hurts. If you look at all independent sources, you will see that China ranks near the bottom when it comes to press freedom. That's just a fact. If any network or newspaper in China wants to report, they have to be filtered by the Communist Party in Beijing. They have to go through the very rigid censorship process, and there has been a number of incidents where editors have resigned. I don't believe it's a case that Chinese journalists are bad people. I think some of them are decent journalists and they want to do their job. They want to be objective, but they can't, because there's so much state control on the media in China. I mean, you don't need to be a genius to work this out. There's mouthpieces like Xinhua, which really, it's quite obvious. CCTV is a little bit more less forthright about it. They're still controlled by the party, but they're more... You can tell the journalists on there are trying to be objective. They're trying to be good journalists. I can see that. But they have their hands tied, because they're in a country where there is no press freedom, pretty much. Now, people will turn around and say, oh look, we can have dialogue on cyberspace, and there's lots of different Chinese websites where you can criticize the party, etc. That might be true, but the fundamental fact is still there, that Chinese media is controlled by the party. It's indisputable. And media that tries to get anything through, for example talking about corruption and that sort of thing, there's a strong chance it will be censored. Sensitive trials are always subject to heavy censorship, especially when it comes to things like people who have campaigned against corruption. And by the way, if you type in something like Tiananmen Square 1989 on a Chinese website, that will be blocked. I'm sorry, but that is just a fact. And I wish these people would If they're going to criticize Western media, I would say, well, at least show you're consistent. Okay, criticize Western media, but if you really care about press freedom, then also criticize Chinese media. If you're so bothered about press objectivity, then also criticize Chinese media. I don't see them doing that. Basically, the source of their argument was that one of the big networks, I think it was the BBC, used images of Nepalese police beating Tibetan protesters, and in the report they said it was Chinese police. Now, I'm the first to say that the BBC has made many big mistakes, and sometimes there has been a biased angle. But you know, it's ironic that they say the BBC is biased against China, because many in the West actually think the BBC is far too much on the political left. There's some Americans even believe the BBC is a communist organisation, so that's ironic. But there's a few things I'd like to point out. You accuse Western journalists of bias, and okay, I'll play the devil's advocate, maybe they are. But it's very difficult to report freely inside China. Now, how can you expect journalists to do their jobs objectively, and to show both sides, and to show the full story, when there's plainclothes thugs harassing them, for example, outside courthouses? And this is a problem. I'd be very happy to show you the sources for that, to show you the footage of those people being harassed just because they're trying to do their job. So the next time you shout about Western media bias, consider just how difficult it is for Western reporters to do their work inside China. If you have a problem with bias, then put pressure on your government to give journalists more of a to lay off journalists, let them do their job. And then, if they're still biased, sure, criticise them. But the only reason there's this perception of bias is because they do not have the practical reach in order to do their job properly. The BBC is the world's biggest broadcaster. It has many faults. Believe me, I agree it has many faults. But I don't think you're being objective. I don't think you're looking at the whole picture and considering just how hard it is for Western reporters to do their work inside China. If China was a country that didn't have a problem with press freedom, then I could maybe see your argument. But as it stands, China is one of the worst countries in the world for freedom of reporting. That's just a fact. By contrast, the BBC regularly makes reports about problems with the British government. So, for example, you say it's biased against China, but what you fail to realise or acknowledge is that the BBC often runs reports, for example, about the MP's expenses scandal we've had in the UK, about the scandal at News of the World. It's a tabloid newspaper. So the idea that it's picking on China is rubbish. You know, you're just looking at it from a nationalistic perspective. You're responding defensively because you think it's attacking China. But actually, if you look at the BBC, it scrutinises every country, especially Britain. A lot of people in Britain think it's biased against the government, in fact. So, you know, the idea that has this agenda against China is a lot of rubbish. And I think, frankly, this comes back to the Middle Kingdom. This sort of idea that China is the centre of the universe, and oh, how dare they criticise China. I've news for you. You're a sovereign state, and with that comes responsibility. No country in the world is above criticism. And if you're Chinese and you're watching this, and you say, oh, he's a Westerner, he's biased, my question to you is why? Why is China above criticism? Okay? Why is it you believe that China should never face any criticism? So to me there's a profound arrogance around this, and I am fed up with it. I'm not here to say that something like the BBC is perfect. No, I'm not saying that. It has got its problems, right? I'm not saying it shouldn't be criticised, but at least that criticism should be in the context of understanding why it's so difficult to report in a country like China. And I believe at that time there was basically hysteria. These Chinese nationalists were stirred up because they thought Western media was biased, so you had all these violent, aggressive displays all over the world with the torch relay. I think some of it was based on emotions, because China had just went through a terrible tragedy, and that's something that I would never trivialise. It was a terrible event. I'm talking about the Sichuan earthquake. So I believe that was an emotional response to the idea that China was under attack, because it's a country that had been through a terrible natural disaster, so there was a defensive mechanism, and I think that's one of the main reasons why at that time we saw very hysterical nationalism from many Chinese. I'm not talking about everyone, but and by the way, it isn't only Westerners that think this. I know I've seen a lot of other Asian people have also commented on this. Filipinos, South Koreans, Vietnamese have also commented on this issue. So it isn't just Westerners. But all I'm saying is, I'm not saying that you can, if you think there's a genuine unfairness in terms of how your country's being portrayed, I'm not saying you can't talk about that. But what I am saying is, look at the background. Look at the context in which they're reporting. And look at how difficult it is for them to do their job in China. If you're going to criticize a so-called bias, then also criticize the fact that the communist regime doesn't allow objective reporting. It does not allow people to show both sides. Basically, and look at the number of companies that have had to pull out of China because their CEOs were fed up with having to toe the party line and do everything the Communist Party wanted them to do, and not show objective reports. I think the CEO of Yahoo was one of the latest to step down, but I may be wrong about that. It was another big Western company. But the fact that they go on YouTube in order to rant about biased Western media, again, just demonstrates hypocrisy to me. YouTube is banned in China. So tell me why, okay? If China's so wonderful, tell me why YouTube is banned, okay? I'm just fed up with this defensive sort of nationalism that is very, very frequent online. And I have news for Chinese nationalists. We're not going to be bullied by you, okay? Just because we're reporting on a controversial issue, we will not be bullied, we will not be silenced because of your threats, because of your aggressive nationalism. No, I don't think we should be. And I think David Cameron should be saying to the Chinese leadership, we're not going to tolerate our journalists being treated in this way. They're here to do a job. They're here to report the news. They don't expect to be harassed and roughed up by guys in plain clothes who are clearly employed by the CCP. So that's all I have to say, really. If you don't like what I have to say, well, I'm prepared to hear a counter-argument. I'm prepared to hear how you justify journalists being violently harassed. And if you want evidence for that, I'll be happy to show it. One final point, I'm not saying the BBC is perfect. They may well have got some things wrong about China. And at times there may have been a bias. Maybe they should be a little bit more positive as well. Okay, I acknowledge that. But it's not true that they're always negative. I've seen a lot of Western reports that show positive things about China. So, you know, you're only picking and choosing the negative. So, that's my thoughts.